Okay. Anyway, the title of my project is called Meander Inn, and essentially,
Well, keep on going. That's how we start.
the idea of my project was to find different ways to circulate through corridors and public space while having some type of relationship with the neighborhood. My proposed community for my project is a multi-generational group with 3 different housing types. So we started with the sectional home, or I looked towards the sectional home for as kind of a building block to find what the morphology and what the look of the unit would be. Another aspect from our previous projects was the horizontal home. An interesting investigation that I had with this project was the idea of going outdoor to inhabit other spaces and kind of that transition between indoor and outdoor. So building these 2 pieces together, what I took from the horizontal home and the sectional home were these building blocks and pieces that would craft different housing units. One aspect that I really found interesting was the bridge that was in the sectional home and how that connected an outdoor space to an indoor space. So building off of what was done in the sectional and horizontal home, I came up with a very simple grid. Blocks of 14 by 14 squares that created basically so the building units that I came up with were for a multi-generational community. One unit, a unit A, is a young professional. B is the short couple. And the goal of these is really come together. Some site observations. The site is by John Missouri Street, and primarily what we did was map the site, look at different aspects, particularly making some expenses, sidewalks, different forms of. So moving into my project, this is the axon. Essentially, it's 3 bars that are parallel to each other, and to access the interior of the space, we use these bridges to cross over what is inhabitable. So one of the important aspects of the home title comes from is this idea of shifting housing units to allow for circulation through space. So what I found is by having an 18-foot bar with these 14-foot blocks, or excuse me, a 32-foot span with 14-foot blocks, span, just by shifting these units over. This is my first floor, and essentially the programmatic elements are square and separated into kind of segments so that the interior of the section I found the third floor interesting because these bridges come across and connect different aspects of the bar. One area that I thought could be developed a bit more was this in-between space where you have the home, which has its private courtyard, and then a more communal area that you might classify as neighbor. So below. So in this section, I found it interesting how you could like have these units set up kind of in very similar ways, but also have enough space to kind of move through each corridor. This is a porosity diagram, which I thought was interesting. It really shows just how open the space is and how many open courtyards there are, and kind of how you can almost see through the space into other areas of the building. This is perspective. It is kind of the interior of the space, and one of the things that I was interested in was the bridges and kind of how they So one other aspect of this is the green roof on top of the middle portion of the building. I found that having a central area that can join together within the project is a really good way of bringing our community together.
So I know the assumption is that this takes place in the near future and issues of, since it's in close proximity to the river, issues of flooding, ground condition, etc., need to be taken into consideration. What are your thoughts on that? Site ecology.
Interesting comment because that future aspect, I don't think we covered that as much, but thinking about like how maybe this maybe progress ideas of like communal living, how you interact with your neighbors.
But like, what are your thoughts on the site ecology, like the ground condition, and how it's occupied? What happens there? Because right now it's mostly undefined. Right.
Sure. Yeah. When we visited the site, I thought it was interesting that it was relatively flat, it's higher ground. I guess in my project, I thought of the plinth as like a good support for the project to stand on, and maybe unintentionally created like my surface to kind of rest the project on.
It's flat. No, the site is flat.
It's like relatively.
You didn't, yeah. Well, you didn't create any kind of quality on the site.
No.
And what is the ground material?
The ground material?
Yeah.
Oh, the plinth. Well, wood, I think makes the most sense in New Orleans. I would envision it as wood.
All of it is covered with wood.
Oh, no, not the building.
No, no. I'm talking about all of this.
The surface of the ground.
The surface.
Yeah, unfortunately, this doesn't depict any true materiality. But
is it a hard surface, or is it a soft surface, or is it a combination of?
I would hope that it would be both. I think that is kind of the most practical in this sense.
To cover all of it with wood?
What do you think?
No, I mean, first of all, it's a lot of material, right?
Sure.
But So you're like that plinth, what is that made of? You're building this up 3 feet or 2 feet?
Yeah, it's 7-inch rise on each, so
Okay,
4 cells.
right. So you're creating this platform, right, of sorts. So you know the general question is, and yeah, maybe you didn't get to around to think about it yet, right? But I think specifically in this location, right, and in many areas of the city, we have to be very mindful of using right the site condition, right, as kind of like as a as a point of friction, right, and as a creative point of departure for thinking about how the ground can be utilized to work with the site, work with the buildings, work with the nature, right? So water management, right, is an important issue, right? So if everything is covered in wood, you have to think about where does the water go, right, and how the water is collected, right, how the water is, right, moved away from the buildings, right, and what happens to the water, right, specifically over 300 by 300 feet. How big is the block?
It's 276. Yeah, it's
So right, you can differentiate very broadly between hard surfaces and soft surfaces. You also walk on specific surfaces easier than others. Right? So where are the walkways? Right? How do I get to the entrances of the building? Right? What happens with the other areas? Right? Where could you insert like a vegetation strategy, right, that provides shade, that again controls water management, etc., that defines the space as collective space for gathering, right? You have a few trees there at the beginning, so you have started to think about that, but that probably could be expanded on. And then also the ground condition is the most accessible condition, right? If you enter the site, that's where you are first, because before you go out from the buildings. And your collective space seems to be located on the roof. Right, so the question is, why not take more advantage of the ground condition, right, as a space for spending time together, for collective living, however it's illustrated, right? So that's where I would probably have moved the project a little bit more, right? The spaces in between the 3 slabs, how can they be utilized at the ground level? What happens at the ground level programmatically again?
So I mean, programmatically. Markets and water salinization came to mind. Specifically, just kind of in that area, there's like a very friendly.
Here? Like
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
in here?
I can go back to the.
Yeah.
So this is a program on the ground floor.
Mhm.
And, yeah, it's mainly on the ground floor because I think that's the most accessible. To be used in other means, not just by the immediate community, but perhaps
Right.
visitors passing by.
So even more so the opportunity, right, to really think about the spaces that surround those programs, right? They're not very open right now. Like you have a couple of windows, it seems, but they don't seem to open themselves up to the outside reach. Right, so I would think about like how they can be orchestrated, by how can the spaces bleed right into the surrounding site context, right, and really engage the shared spaces in between the buildings for the program. Right, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
We go back to your excellent chalk tools is at the bottom of those plans. Is that right? Is it on the left side?
It's correct. It's on the bottom.
Okay. So, you're coming at this project with this premise of meandering and creating these paths and creating these sort of interstitial spaces that people can communally enjoy together and connect with each other. But as Cordula said, it starts with your entry to the site, and your meandering pathways start from the sidewalk and work their way in. Since I don't see any parking on the site, I'm assuming people are parking around the site and then entering in from each of the perimeter conditions. And it just seems like the ground floor plane is not developed to the extent or to any extent that we can get a sense of how do those paths even start. Like, why do I want to go on a path through a building when you're not giving me any incentive to even enter the site? Like, it doesn't look very welcoming. Just in that sense, lack of vegetation, lack of trees is very, very important, especially in these dense older neighborhoods. And then my follow-up question to that would be, how did you consider this building and how it would fit in with the surrounding context, surrounded by some industrial buildings since we're Chaptulas, but a large number of single and double historic buildings, right? So a lot of times when we talk about larger projects in this city, it's quite difficult. It's a lot of education of neighborhoods and people who would come out and say, that's too big, I don't want it here. That's the refrain we hear all the time. So it's about mitigating the scale between needing higher density for sustainability and, housing all of our population and fitting in with the neighborhood to a certain extent. So we talk about, breaking these buildings down, which when you show me your perspective view from one of the courtyards, I start to be a little more convinced. But these are very rigid bars of houses as they were, and they look relentless, in comparison to the smaller houses around them, especially the three on the site, which don't seem to me have been considered in the overall planning of this as part of, this is the program of the site, and we're gonna sort of stitch our building into this existing block with these existing buildings. It's, you kind of put them all on one side and then my project is on the other side, and it's almost like a wall is created. But I think your staircases and your bridges and things like that are really interesting and dynamic, and those could be the places where you start to, touch the other parts of the site, reach out to the neighbors. Like, I see the stairs coming out on the far left, right? So they're like projecting out and looking over the street. I think those are moments where you can start to do this kind of mitigation between the smaller residential structures around you and your larger, more substantial infill project. This is a challenge that we have all the time in this city, and it really takes a lot of nuanced moves to get it right and to have it fit really well, so it feels comfortable and not alien, and so that the neighborhood at large is more welcoming and supportive of it. And then I think, excuse me, in terms of the drawings themselves, I think I would have really liked to see a developed set of circulation diagrams and studies and vignette views of, you're on the path and then you're here, and you're on the path and then you're here, you know what I mean? Because if that's the impetus of the project, I think that should really be highlighted. And I think there's a diagram that shows circulation and building, and the circulation, I think, is the darkest color, which seems kind of aggressive when I feel like your project is more about being uplifting and, people hanging out and enjoying the rooftop and being in the light and all this kind of stuff. So the graphic presentation of the paths, I don't think is, the way it's represented here is not doing justice to the way you talk about it and your intentions for it and how you want people to experience that within the project.
I believe that you have so in New Orleans, the classic blocks that you have around, they have a perimeter intention. No? They look around all the streets and they live in between it. In your case, you have take a really hard positioning of making parallel lines to a specific street. So it seems that whenever you propose a scheme like that, and more whenever you are willing to have public spaces, you should explain how parallel lines can give a public space that is as good as a courtyard in a traditional way in New Orleans. So I think it's weird not to listen why the parallel lines are this way. You don't talk about orientation, for example. It will be really interesting how to take advantage of, I'm placing these blocks north, south, because I'm going to be protected from the south, making porches like the traditional forms, and using the north to have a fresh light, so you don't have direct sun. So an intentional direction can give you many opportunities. So you could talk in the project about those things, and I'm sure that are there. I was really another thing in research that you have to propose who is this project for, and things like that. And you were talking about multi-generational stream that I thought it was really interesting. But I think there are some things that are important, like some of the things that they have talked about having a clear way of how to use this building. How do I access? How do I arrive? How do I go to an elevator? You don't have elevators. And we will have to think, okay, you have that kind of open mind proposal from young people and older people. They will be interested to emphasize, as she was saying, in the circulation and having a good accessibility elevators, so everybody can join, or things like that, that they will put together more why this scheme of lines and why is multi-generational building. How architecture is strategy. And I think you have those houses that they are always trying to have build this an empty pocket of courtyards or with terraces or public area that is great in Orleans and not having it try because you have shadow. But how can different types of people interact with that? It will be great to see that forward. But I have two pieces that are from young people, maybe that becomes a barbecue space, but I have other area that is mixed use because it's just all the typologies together. So I think there are many opportunities there, but I think either you haven't time to explore them or you haven't explained them with the emphasize of the scheme and the typologies. But they have great.
Thank you.
Is anybody taking the time? Thank you. Thank you.
Just when you guys are presenting, just make sure to look back at either me or Evan, just to know how much time.
Just clap your hands.
Charlotte Kelly. Thank you, Justin. There's a lot of things to consider. So it always helps to identify maybe right. I know yourself to keep or like find like a topic that you're mostly interested in, and then really make that your focal point. Because it's really hard to cover it all.
Housing is hard.
Housing is hard, indeed, right? So this idea of orientation, right? General organizational strategy on the side, right? Should be clarified. But then, what do you focus on, right? Is it site technology, right? Is it units and unit arrangements and accessibility, right? It helps to have some kind of theme, I guess, like that everything else is kind of working with.
And I'm sure many things are already there, but you have to also practice with an exercise that you explain them because we can't see all the platforms. It's great to see that also like really well explained how you're taking advantage of those ideas.
And how you explain that stuff goes back to when you have to present a project like this to a neighborhood association, when they scream at you, you need to teach them why you're doing the things you're doing. Why is this good for the community, good for the neighborhood, good for the site? So, you have to convince them.
And one thing that kind of in retrospect looking at this, like having a risk with I think there's a very big opportunity, but maybe back or massive ones, like where do
Yeah, relief.
But it really helps, it's not, the four sides to the site are different, right? Chocotulas is a much different condition than the back side is. So how do you respond to that? Yes. Just a kind of.
So, hi, my name is Charlotte. My poster is over there. Look at it. And then I also have a model on this site. Okay. So this collective housing project is a project identified a typical urban block in New Orleans high ground, shown in the green here, and this is where the site is going to be, as a quality solution to future housing crisis related to increasingly uninhabitable flood zones, shown in the pink. So my approach is titled Coloring Outside the Lines, which will achieve this by multiplying the original number of houses on the block by 3 while maintaining the complexities of the neighborhood's personality, by allowing for the natural overlap of public and private space through exposed interstitial spaces. And so this elevation is from across the street of all 4 sides of the proposed block off Tchoupitoulas, which shows how the homes are characterized by this sporadic spacing and also porches, which is what gives the neighborhood its dynamic personality. And so these are some of those interstitial spaces. They show little clues of like who your neighbor is, like this person has a ghost pepper plant, this person has a disco ball. And these kinds of things are what makes what could be just a group of homes a feeling of community. So this idea of coloring outside the lines comes from representing the saturation of life visibly overlapping the barriers of an isolated home. So for the actual organization of the new homes, this is the original grain before, and then the property lines were extended to make a grid to simplify the crowding of the new homes. And then the grid was scrapped to give room for these interstitial spaces and allow for wiggle room to follow the grain of the rest of the city. So on the ground floor, there's a covered lobby space that gives access to 68% of the homes with interstitial spaces that are closed off by light screen elements. And the vertical cores are shown in pink. And these scribbles show the public access to the center. And then this is the second floor, which shows how 32% of the homes from below are stacked and access from the second and a half floor by, and then the single unit buildings from below have a rooftop that has secondary access from this floor too. So in section, the homes work with these half heights using the ROM plan to give views of other levels to continue the idea of seeing the public and private overlap, like with these roof gardens that are seen from all levels of the project. So this is like my type A house, this is loft, and even like within the homes, you can see the idea of overlapping the public and private space, like with this see-through bookshelf, and in sections, since it's a loft, the bedroom is open. And then this is the loft stacked on the second floor. So again, it's this idea of ROM plan. And even like the units themselves are kind of blending together. And then this is the large house. So sorry to go back. This is the same footprint, but they're type C stacked on top of type D. And again, like the plan is like very open, go along with that same idea. And this is kind of like reanalyzing the project. And you can see how the original grain of public and private is sort of internalized. And it shows how it shows how these like blending allows for moments like this, where this private, semi-private space behind the window can blend with the access here, and like it allows for moments that could improve like the economy within the small home. Like this person can sell whatever produce they have on their rooftop garden and that kind of thing. So maybe like they have a farmer's market some days where all the residents can participate using these windows. And this is a view of the public space inside of the project. And again, you can see like the circulation here with views from the second floors and the rooftop gardens, and it all kind of blends together. And so in the end, well, in my plot, that acts on. You can kind of see how in the end it becomes sort of saturated with life in a way that encourages community sustainability and economic stability. So when you were, laying out or developing your massing strategy of the distribution of these clusters, what role did the initial analysis of you have these beautiful street elevations, what role did that play in your consideration of how the unit clusters are distributed on the site? Yeah, I think like kind of the diagrams that I showed, like these, I kind of wanted to start more with like scale. Like that's why I extended the plot lines here. So even though they're smaller, it's like the same scale that I could then like give wiggle room to follow the porches and the side yards and give them space so that they were not all up against each other. So they had room for those porches. But is there some kind of evaluation that determines or that kind of evaluates or gives hierarchy to Chaputula Street, which is here, right? Versus, Arabella, etc., right? Because those are different conditions in accordance with your elevations. Right. Yeah. I kind of decided to take an approach where I didn't really give this a hierarchy. The only difference is that I put Frankie and Johnny's, the restaurant, on Chapatulas so that it, gave them more business and was very visible from that main street. But like, if I go back to here, you can see the neighborhood doesn't really differentiate on Chapatulas that much. So it was kind of the approach I took. The only focus was the restaurant.
Chapatulas being a very busy thoroughfare along the river. For most of it, you have port, you have warehouse buildings and things like that. Obviously, you have warehouse right across the street. So I probably would have thought that it would be denser near to Chapatulas, and then again, it's similar to the other project, break down and scale a little bit. So I do really appreciate that you've got these different heights going on in these clusters of residences. But when we step down into the neighborhood, you can ease off a little bit and sort of start to stitch those in a little bit more. And the other thing that I was thinking is that, you showed these lovely images of existing buildings with their porches and how that mediates between the private space and the street and creates that culture. And I understand that you're creating that culture within your site, but you also want the people who live there to be connected to the neighborhood as well. So I would have thought maybe in your plans, your individual home plans, on the first floor, you give those units opportunity to have a door on the street. It's really important to have front doors on the street to feel like, it's a security thing as well, eyes on the street helps everyone. But just from an urban development standpoint, you don't want to completely turn your back on everything around you. And so as you have these communal spaces for your private residents inside, they also need to look outward as well to be good neighbors.
Yeah, I think like for that, it was really just like a security thing. Like all of our homes had to be accessed from a lobby space on the inside. But that's like why I put in the screen elements to like keep it open and visible.
Yeah, and I like those very much. It creates very nice, sort of permeability, right? But in a lot of the plans, it seems like, you've got the living spaces closer to the street, which makes a lot of sense. And you could have maybe a little porch or something in some of those cases.
Yeah, I agree. But they are talking about the relation of the cluster with the outside and what is the space in between, and also the relation of each of the units with the cluster. And I think that's something you should have considered on the scale, like the relation that you achieve in this cluster
they are completely different to the relation that you achieve in this house, for example. So I don't know if you should maybe have established some kind of rules, like, okay, here's my thing. And first of all, congratulations on the graphic because it's so unified the presentation, but it's great to see. But I was expecting whenever you have put the plan to start reading that, okay, this is pink, maybe this part of the houses were kind of pink too, but maybe, I don't know if there would be like a hierarchy, like, okay, the kitchens and the living areas are going to be attached to those kind of communal porches. So they come here to have lunch and to join the people. And then the bedrooms and the other things are going to be open up. No? So that kind of relation that you are establishing between the pink and the yellow, but also translate into the typologies. That would be, I think, something interesting.
I have like 2 questions about the graphics. So are all the houses double, like 2 floors?
Yeah, so all of the houses, like the shortest one, this is the smallest height, and they all reach at the porch, the 2.5 height, which is the second.
So every house has access from the street. They don't. There's no obviously like apartments that
Oh,
they
no.
use second level.
Yeah, they are.
Right.
In the second floor, all of these homes are only accessed from the second floor.
So there are
They're
apartments in the
stacked.
same.
Yeah, so that's type E and C.
So I think like in that case it's even more clear that maybe the size of the cluster sometimes I think they have gotten too big. Even some houses inside of the condition of the pink that I don't think is the only condition that they can enjoy now. I think the interest of the project is the double condition. They talk to each other and then
I think you've done an excellent job developing some, conceptual ideas about your project. I love this, the diagram, right, of the, what do you call it, coloring outside the lines, right? I think that's a really beautiful idea. And I also, I really appreciated, the analysis of the elevations surrounding the site. And I think if you have such a strong setup, you need to make sure that you execute it in your project, right, to its fullest potential, right? So this idea of really thinking about maybe a catalog of these, coloring outside the line spaces, right? What's like to use the private, semi-private, but shared, public. I think there's different gradients that you can introduce, right, from the unit to the outside, right? You have a large exterior area that right now is fairly uniformly treated, right? But there's a lot of nuances or variation that can be introduced, right, in regards to, where it's bordering the neighbors, different qualities of neighbors or neighborhood scales, right? Internal shared space, right? Shared space or accessible space that's right outside the units, as you showed with these overall window conditions, etc. So it would be interesting to maybe think about a catalog of these, or gradient of these shared or collective spaces or accessible spaces in relationship to the coloring outside the lines diagram. And then again, a response to the neighborhood, surrounding neighborhood contextual variations in regards to how the clusters are positioned, like their density, right? And maybe also their scale, I think is something that you could fold in, right? Because you set your project up, your presentation up that way, so it would be helpful to translate it. But I really appreciate that you thought about these, initial conceptual ideas, or develop them and try to fold them into.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that maybe the word is rigor. So your idea is coloring outside the lines, but you have a playbook that very definitely sets the lines. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that you end up with a project that feels exciting and feels complex the way that you're depicting it, but it does have these thresholds, right? That each thing responds to. Can you, and I also think that your presentation was excellent. I really appreciate the attention to detail in developing these different housing types, offering this kind of variety is really important as well. I did want to ask a little bit about your materiality. It looked like everything was very sort of monotone, which I really like, by the way. But New Orleans isn't really like that. It's not a city like that. And again, to keep, and I know I keep going back to this because we deal with this all the time in our practice. It's like you need to fit in with the neighborhood a little bit more. A large project that's all a single material, even if it's, you know, individual houses or would appear to be individual houses, can feel a little overwhelming. So even subtle variations in that can help, even changing the direction of the material, you know, something like that, to give it a little bit more of that eclectic quality that New Orleans has amassed over time through, you know, assimilation and assemblage, instead of all the houses being built at once, you know, as a development.
Yeah, in the end, they
I mean, I think that's awesome. I love it. I love it. But the neighbors around it, they would come to the city council meeting and screaming. So in some ways, we can only push so far in this town. I think there's other cities where this would work beautifully as a single piece. And Jonathan Tate's project obviously works really, really well. But he does use lap siding, which is more traditional, instead of this, which reads much more modern, which again, I love, but you know.
And helping for that, for the materiality and gradient that they were talking, the idea of the porches that they were bringing up before, in that gradient, it would not only help also getting into the line of the outside, but also helping in the aesthetic and in the decoration of these units that
Yeah.
are so massive right now into the quality of how materialize the housing.
Yeah, we look at porches, we look at proportion of windows, we look at ceiling heights, roof lines, the pitch of the roof, you know, going back to Creole cottages or shotgun houses, you know, looking at those roof pitches and those kind of subtle things can help you really sort of nestle yourself into a very historic neighborhood in a really nice way. It still is very, very modern and fresh and new, but becomes part of the sort of living history of the city, right?
Yeah, then I can be next to the hello, my name is Naomi. My board is here, and I also have a site model over there. This project is called Place of Performance. It's a collective housing proposal for performing artists in New Orleans, featuring many places for rehearsal and practice and showcase throughout the site. Aims to bring live music and performance, which is such a pinnacle of New Orleans culture, to a more permanent location uptown. So to start off with the horizontal home, this is where I began focusing on courtyards with different characters. So the courtyard at the front of the house is different in character from the back of the house. You can see it incorporating space. And then with the vertical home, this element became what became the bar building on top of this in the project. With a central stair that creates staggered landings and through these interlocked volumes. And then exploring sectional relationships. Here is exploring meandering circulation and opposing courtyards, which ended up being the start for much of the housing on the site. Because when I took these houses or like mirrored them, and these courtyards became collective spaces, multiple units that can be shared, and the meandering circulation can extend throughout the site so that people are sort of forced to interact in their daily lives and also relate both to the street and the inner block. And then this is just a fun project. I feel like I didn't take the morphology into the place of performance, but this is where I started having fun exploring ways became important. Now moving on to the site, you can see this distribution of non-residential program with the site over here, One of the things I noticed most when visiting was the noise condition of Tchoupitoulas, and wanted to focus on a way of sort of shielding the block from that, providing residents a way so that they don't have to be exposed to that noise, that busyness all the time. And then moving on to the porches, I know Charlotte did a really good job explaining the porches around the site. But I think something really cool that erupted during the pandemic was these porch concerts, something that I think will stick around for a long time. So I wanted to create spaces where that could happen at various scales, both relating into the block and also onto the street. And then this is a project in New Orleans. I was inspired in concept, not necessarily in morphology, but it's Music Box Village. It's created by a community of artists for the artists. And you can sort of see how people inhabit different levels to watch the performances. It's very multi-purpose, and it's located here. And then I was also focused on relationships between balconies and how you could create a condition that wasn't claustrophobic, but still allowed for interaction across the balconies if you'd like to. So moving back here, you can see this larger volume relating more to the urban industrial scale of Tchoupitoulas, sort of creating a gradient down as you extend into the residential area. And then there's also a theater and an outdoor amphitheater so that the residents there can showcase their craft, but also the public can also use the spaces. This sort of shows how everything fits together. Along Tchoupitoulas, I relocated Frankie and Johnny's. There's like a studio space that could be rented out, but also the people living there could use it to practice and rehearse. A craft like maker space for people to build costumes or sets. The theater space, and then the lobby, and then the outdoor amphitheater. And then moving along here, these two houses needed to remain on the site, and then I kept this third house on the corner to convert to like proper costume storage. And then here you can see the meandering circulation throughout the units. And then these are where the vertical homes came into play along Tchoupitoulas. And here you can see the aggregation of the sectional units. And so this sort of shows the existing footprint, vegetation, and access. There's a lot of points of access, mostly concentrated along Tchoupitoulas and Annunciation. And then with my project, I sort of condensed that access, but still wanted to relate to these key lots along the side and keep much of this existing vegetation here, the larger trees. And then eliminate some of the access on Tchoupitoulas and make sure that this urban grain will still exist. That's not the plans of these here. There we go. So this is the first level. You can see the public program. The theater and the amphitheater are sort of mirrors that those two relate. And then you can see where some of the units touch the ground, but then there's access underneath some of them from the sides. And then here there is a path that creates sort of a procession to both of the theater spaces. And then moving on to, wait a second, I'm sorry. Well, this is what I wanted to show. It's on the fourth level. This is another area of access. And so you can see this elevated walkway that meanders through the units. There we go. Okay. Really quick with the section, these show the sectional units in relation to the two houses that are there. This is where you could walk underneath those breezeways. Then moving on to the units, the sectional, I'm going to talk about it once, there we go. This is where the medium sectional house plus a loft space. in section, this would be the loft space and this would be the medium-sized sectional house. But then combining those two, I could get a larger unit, and then removing the bottom floor, I could create space for people to walk in. And then the vertical house, I had two variations, one where it was entirely one unit and another where there were 2 points of access in the center. And so one unit we were talking about was on the common. And then here you can see people walking along this path, watching a performance, also being able to see different spaces from their balconies. And then here you can see, like, if someone was walking underneath the breezeway, you can see the street in the background, but then also people can interact with them and walk.
Well, I think your introduction to the project was the part of the intentional community is really there. No? Like you are really looking for artists, the public amenities, the sports sponsors. So you are talking all the time about these conditions that I think you have done a great effort. Also, like the public uses around the city and how you achieve that. So I think the scheme of having this kind of long lines going in one direction, but then having that kind of transversal line which uses is a really clear scheme. So I think that's something that is clear and it makes it together. And I think your graphics are really good too. So that's that. And thank you for having North Arrow these days that we really appreciate. So that's great to see it. But I think when it comes to the ground level plan, this scheme of having lines in one direction and public in the other. Imagine that you live in the block that is the third house. You have the plan, the third house in the line in between. Yes, I think the meander circulation it can get like interesting moments, but also it can be a little bit not the most successful way of how to make like a clear circulation for a house. I think that those areas that they are like all vegetation, I think it should be more permeable, the way that you are entering somehow, how to arrive in this house, like what through all things, no? So I think that's something you should consider in the ground level, like having a bigger permeability in this direction, even if the housing project is in this direction, because I think it will make it work better, and also making clear where are the doors, no? At the end, having like elevated houses. Yeah.
There are these ends of this. This is like I'm not quite cemetery, but not grass, something that is slightly raised.
Wondering what happens there.
There's like
problematic.
so
They're very large areas, right?
yeah, I was envisioning those as like places that could be used for a porch concert, because they would connect both to this street here and also the walk. But so
Actually, this condition is like this one, only the pavilion,
yeah,
But not covered, right?
they're essentially
All these are covered, right?
yeah.
And that's partially covered.
but this is covered too, because that's 100%
Yeah, yeah,
so it's covered.
yeah, it's
So I think those covered areas they could be more connected.
Yeah, I think like a really deep dive into the ground and paths and permeability of the site and how it feels from this side. Because you're sort of bringing the public in that way. But again, from this side and this side, that connection with the neighborhood is really important. This is already interacting with the street. I think that's a great use. I also think it's really important along top tools, creating a little bit of a barrier for the residents behind.
And you do that, I'm sorry. You do a great job in the section, how to show the public not starting to work with the scale of the housing compared to the scale of the bottom part of the public uses.
but I think we could emphasize more how it's the dialogue of how those houses have a different condition for being in the front of the park. Have like a better quality house, or I don't know how to feel like create that condition. Yeah.
I think you've done I think the project or the proposal is successful in a couple of points, right? And what I like is that you consider the existing vegetation, right? As something that helps you to continue to organize the site with the new school, right? And that plan that I showed, where you showed the distribution of massing on the site in response to the neighbors, that was really successful. And that's where the project started to make sense to me. Right, and also then, like naturally, right, literally speaking, naturally, creates this open pocket right here, which opens to the neighborhood because all of these are existing trees, right?
The larger ones in plan are the existing ones, smaller ones are the ones that
So
I added.
I think that's a really nice consideration, right? In reality, when we do a lot of construction, it's always difficult to negotiate existing vegetation, and save it. But but I think that's a really nice thought. Where I think things fall apart for me a little bit is when it comes to the kind of like the extrusion, right, of the massing. It feels like, and that's the setup of the semester, right? You have all these different steps, and then in the end you have to bring it all together. I feel like you incorporated everything, but components stayed singular in a way, right? And have a little bit of a struggle, merging together, right, as kind of like a more uniform idea for the block, right? So I can see the separate components, right? And I think that axon up there, right, really shows that, right? But as an ensemble for the site, right, it's not quite successful yet, right?
Okay.
And maybe you agree with that. And I think it has to do with the ground condition and how all these open spaces are treated, these covered spaces. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but you also have to think about the proportion of them, right? And if you have so many of the same quality, are they really all going to be utilized, right? Or utilized, right? The rectilinear shape, right? That you're really passing through, right? So you have to think about their orientation, right? And their use, right? And the quality of different uses. And then I'm not sure if the word meandering would necessarily come to mind, when I look at the walkways, because they're not really, distributed to me with some kind of legible logic at the moment, right? Like they really emphasize the meandering, right, and transversing the site, right, with an intention, right, or a clear strategy, right? So I think the components are there, and it seems like they're working in themselves, but as an ensemble, I feel like, like it could come together with a stronger. Is everything clad in wood at the moment?
I mean,
All
the way I have it rendered, but
Right. So one strategy could be that you say, okay, it's fine, like it's like things work together, but they're also quite distinguished, right, or distinct. Right? There's this cluster that does this, and this cluster that does that, and then this cluster that does something, right? And then maybe, and that's fine too, right? And then they're clearly separate or legible as separate ideas, right? And separate types of occupancy, and that might mean that the material quality changes, right? And the fenestration strategy changes, right? And each is treated differently. Maybe there's 3 different clusters, right? Then that are then express themselves. And through their difference come together.
yeah.
It's
Yeah, thank you.
We talk about that with the first exercise, but this kind of linear response. I know that you are coming and bringing houses from the previous exercise here, so I know I thought with studio last years, I know that happens at the time that they making the adjustment. But whenever you have these linear schemes, I always missing like a response to the north and to the south, or to the east, especially in that block, not that you have a condition inside of the block, outside the Chapatulas, south and north. So I think those houses would have like a more clear response. We were talking, and So I think orientation could be like a part of this, also like more unit to have that kind of pockets, having comfort, how that works, and maybe that would help what I was saying about making a hierarchy of the ground level, like maybe all of the spaces are the same, or something have to be protected because when I go to the street, one has sun. So make those kind of parameters play a role with the typologies and public space. Thank you.